Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. What have you brought to the table today?
Well, I have brought a report by Color of Change and Little Sis called Police Foundations, a corporate-sponsored threat to democracy and Black lives. I think that the reporting here, in terms of digging into some of the secrecy behind these nonprofits, is so important.
Yeah.
It's another piece of the puzzle in looking into the power that police departments hold. These foundations have essentially been used as ways to funnel money into police departments from corporate donors. And then they get to use that donation as a tax break and then potentially leverage it into profits because the department has a relationship with that company now because they donated to the foundation. So I think this report opens up a whole other conversation about how police should be held accountable to the people that they serve, because I think increasing transparency here is super important, because we need to understand how these departments are being funded and where are they getting the money for these new equipment that's being used to surveil or police us or whatever. I think there's a lot of really great reporting here, but it's also alarming in some ways.
Oh man, yes.
There's a lot of remarkable things to think about and ponder as we consider and talk through this particular report.
Yeah. I mean, I think the wild thing about all this is the word you use was secrecy, right? And they sort of illuminate this in the report that all of this is secret, right? This was news to me, this idea of police foundations and what's happening. I had no idea that these police foundations existed and existed in the way that they are existing, to the millions of dollars worth that they're existing. And so, this report was fascinating, right? And also in so many ways infuriating, right? Because it blew my mind to sort of learn about this and sort of see and find out about what's happening, right? I think it was really disturbing to sort of learn about these police foundations and what they're doing and what they've enabled to happen in our country, right? I think it's also insane to learn about how many private donors and sponsors there are for these foundations. The report highlights that it's just over 1,000, or it was 1,200 or something that they found for this report. The thousands. And the idea that there are 55 or so Fortune 500 companies that are backing these foundations, right? That are funding these police foundations, right? And we're talking big companies, right? Bank of America, Microsoft, Amazon, Uber, Verizon, AT&T, Wells Fargo, Target, Walmart. What? And that's just a few of them, right? And so, I don't know. I'm sure we'll dive into more of the nitty gritty of the report. But I think I am just grateful that you found this, that we got to read it, right? That this report is important, and it's important that it exists, right? Because these police foundations exist, but so many of us don't know about them, right? And we don't necessarily know that this is happening in the way that it's happening. And I think it's difficult to grapple with, right? Because as this report sort of lays out, these police foundations are helping police departments across the country, and I think obviously related, our larger criminal punishment system as a whole, and as a result, continue to inflict harm and violence on our communities, right? And especially our Black and brown communities. So it was a lot, right? And there's also just so much in this that is pretty awful and disturbing, right? That these foundations are doing, right? One of the pieces, and I'm going to shut up here, one of the pieces in this report that stood out to me was the story of the Atlanta Police Foundation. And in sort of the wake of Rayshard Brooks's murder by the Atlanta Police Department, there were some sort of conversations that were happening amongst police officers around sort of taking time off, right, and sort of striking, if you will. And the Atlanta Police Foundation gave police officers in that city a $500 bonus, right?
Yep.
Like they had enough money to do that, and so like it's just hard to sort of like, what do you do with that information, right? Like how, like, is this real life? So yeah, this was an incredible report, and so I'm glad we're talking about it.
Yeah, I think the going back to what you said, like the number of corporations who are deeply invested in these foundations is super troubling. And it makes sense, right? Like the origins of policing
Yeah.
in this country are for the protection of rich people's property, mostly, right? And at the start of policing, enslaved people is what we're talking about. And then imposing so-called order on society by like squashing strikes or rebellions. So then we can see that corporations from the beginning of policing have had a vested interest in advancing policing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And in funding police, because they were essentially created to defend these corporations and advance the interests of corporations,
Right.
which used to be called other things. So it's alarming, and it also is like, well, yeah. If you connect the dots here, it makes sense.
Yeah.
And then I think back to that piece about the bonus for officers. It's so hard to imagine walking off the job because somebody I work with murdered someone. And then I was upset that they were being sort of held accountable for that.
Correct.
And then I get $500 because I left my job.
Yeah.
Didn't do it. It doesn't compute for me. And I think my guess is if you asked striking workers who are striking right now at plants across the United States, it also wouldn't compute for them.
Exactly. Great point.
So yeah, that's just bizarre. And then another piece of this is about there aren't requirements for disclosing the donors
Right.
of police foundations. And in the face of some scrutiny a few years ago, a lot of the foundations took down information off their websites, like who serves on their boards, and who are their prominent funders. So they're hiding stuff on purpose to avoid the scrutiny that I think this report is now trying to bring back up in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And rightfully so, but also, yeah, I mean that says a lot, right? Like if you then have to go and make a decision to like, oh, take my name off that, right? Like I mean that to me speaks to some shame and some like, sort of feeling that exists that maybe you're not doing the right thing right here.
Yeah.
And so why are you doing it to begin with? And so, yeah, that's sort of, I think all what's happening for these companies and these foundations in the wake of sort of what happened in 2020, right? Like, and with sort of, as you said, this report sort of coming to light. And the other thing that's so wild is, again, we're talking about millions upon millions of dollars being spent here, right? Like, and so these foundations are sort of dealing in mega money to do things and provide for police departments across the country, right? So we're talking, and this report sort of lays this out in a really great way, right? Like things like armored vehicles and video surveillance equipment and weapons, sort of your everyday weapons to your military grade weapons, right? And like police dogs and police horses, and full on training facilities, right? And SWAT gear and just so much stuff. And so what I appreciated about the report is that it really did a great job in providing like actual examples of all of these things, right? And the cost of them in the various cities across the country, right? So, back to the great city of Atlanta, right? The Atlanta Police Foundation, the report says that it funded like 11,000 surveillance cameras and license plate readers, and that cost $2.6 million.
Yep.
$2.6 million. Like,
Yep.
what is going on? What are we doing with that?
Yeah.
Right?
And then turned Atlanta into the most surveilled city
Yes.
in the U.S.
I think in the U.S.
In the U.S.
I think in the U.S.
Yeah.
Um,
In terms of numbers of camera per person,
yes.
like most surveilled in the
Yes,
U.S.
right. And the report sort of makes the connection, which I don't think is a leap for anybody who's listening in with us, right? That sort of that who is that surveillance really targeting, right?
Right.
And so, I think the other piece that, is connected to this, right, is and the report laid this out as well, is right, like police spending per capita, think since the 1990s has increased nationally since 46 by 46%, excuse me.
Yes.
Right. But we continue to see budget cuts, right, for vital services and sort of social services like education and healthcare and infrastructure, right, and actual interventions and services that would better serve all of us, right, and not to mention like all the people we have in our country who are living in poverty, right, and who aren't making a livable wage, right, like police spending has gone up, and now these police foundations are funneling millions of dollars into their accounts, right? And so, I just sort of think the meat and potatoes of this report, talking about what these police foundations are funding in our communities, right, for these police forces, despite what we actually need, is just mind-boggling. Like, it just kind of made me sick.
Yeah. I mean, so much money is being funneled into these projects that, as you said, aren't actually helping us. And to a certain extent, these projects are only being funded for a couple of years,
Yes.
and then left for the city to pick up, right? So
good
I
point.
think if I am recalling correctly, there were a lot of examples in the report that Atlanta surveillance camera, right? The foundation funded them for a couple of years and then left the city to pick up the tab.
Yep.
After they were like, oh, we're done now. So then they shifted all the fiscal responsibility of managing these things to the taxpayers.
That's right.
For something that, the city, the taxpayers didn't choose to install.
Yep.
So that's really bizarre to think about too, is like, yeah, I think you can say what you want about private money and say how it should be spent, and people are gonna be like, well, they get to spend their money how they want.
Yeah.
And yeah, sure, but you don't get to spend your money to set up some project that then
You abandon.
you just abandon and
Yeah.
give to the city to fund.
Right.
That isn't right in so many ways. And speaking of ridiculous funding, let's talk about these tactical villages for a minute.
Oh gosh.
These are essentially replicas of city blocks designed for arms training,
Yep.
for police departments, which cost millions of dollars. And, and they're mostly provided by the police foundations. But again, this is something that isn't necessary,
Right.
with money that could have gone to some other purpose in the community that the community actually needs,
Right.
rather than a fake city block that we're
They
going
get
to run around
and shoot in.
yeah,
And, yeah.
and do whatever training they're going to do in there, and it's very bizarre. And then there are examples in the report about these tactical villages and how they've been funded and where they've been funded and the opposition people have had.
Yes.
In different cities to them. Like, I think the one in Atlanta, they wanted to build on some protected land, which obviously didn't go over well. Like,
Right.
Yeah. And so part of this too is, as you mentioned, police horses is pastures and stables for horses for the police. So it's just it's a whole lot of ridiculous spending
Yeah.
on things that we don't really need.
We just don't need, right? And again, I'm just going to keep harping. Which one is
Harping.
it?
Harping, yeah.
On. I should know that.
You're not an angel singing. It's not
Hark. There
hark
it is.
the
I
herald
knew
angels.
it was a
Yeah.
word.
It's a word.
Just not the right context. And
Hark.
not the right word for this. On the idea, harping. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah.
On the millions of dollars, and I just keep thinking about. I can't stop thinking about what else we could be using that money for, right?
So many things.
Right? And so I think the other thing that's sort of been just keeps rattling around in my brain, and I just can't get over it, is that it's just wild to me that these police foundations even exist, right? Like,
Yeah.
I just wasn't really aware of this until reading this, right? So it's wild to me that they exist, and that they're in so many major cities across the United States, um, and that they're private, right? And they've been able to sort of operate and are operating like that for some time, right?
Right.
I think that's just sort of mind blowing to me on so many levels, and I think this report really helped me name why that is, right, and why that's the case, right? So, like, for one, it's like these police foundations are operating as private organizations that have a clear agenda, in my opinion. And as we've said here, it's not about serving or to serve real people or our communities, right? One of the parts of this report that stood out to me, and I'm going to quote them, they said, as communities across the nation demand critical investments in what will actually keep us safe, healthy, and housed, police foundations exist to both funnel private money to policing and to secretly continue the militarization of large and small scale police departments across the country. As private entities, police foundations and their corporate sponsors protect corporate interests and increase huge police budgets outside of government oversight, with no accountability to communities that police are sworn to serve. And so, like, that's huge in itself. But the report then later, sort of just a little bit later, goes on to say, by claiming to provide equipment and technology that massively funded police departments, quote unquote, can't afford, police foundations pay for police violence, from SWAT equipment to lethal police dogs officers use to terrorize Black communities, repress protests, and injure racial justice protesters. Right. And so I, I think when I think about this and I think about some of our conversations we've had here about abolition and liberation movements and like the work it's going to take to get us to this place where we live in a society and the kind of society in the world that I hope we get to see one day, right? It's difficult to sort of imagine it when, again, millions of dollars are just sort of secretly bankrolling police forces across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think it's easy to see, or easy to be dismissive, I think, of some of the assertions that this report is making if you have, if you want to, right? Like, I think that you can have a frame of mind going into this where you could dismiss the assertions that the report is making. And so one thing I want to lift up is a piece of the report said almost 40% of the foundations, the current police foundations, 40% of them were created between 2014 and 2016.
Yes.
Right. And so if you think about that in the context of liberation movements, Black Lives Matter, that is a knee-jerk corporate response to Black Lives Matter movements and protests and rebellions in 2014 and 2015.
There it is.
And as I said earlier, it's a corporate knee-jerk response, and they're getting a tax break on it. And they're also in 2020, flash forward a few years, they release statements that say they support racial justice.
Yes.
So it's all very complicated, but it's all right here.
Yeah.
That these foundations are just a way to funnel corporate money into guns, surveillance, whatever other technology. Like the report mentioned some, I think they're called stingrays, which are cell phone device surveillance that they have been using at the police forces across the country, is what I mean by they, have been using at protests over last summer in 2020. So, all of those things are being funded by corporations.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what all of these things are doing. So I wanted to connect those dots because as you were talking about it, I was like, oh, we haven't said anything about this yet, and it dawned on me that we should say, like,
when these
it's
things
a
are
huge
happening.
growth,
Yeah.
and it's clearly a response.
Yeah. Because I think the only police foundation that's been around for a long time is New York City's, right? It's been around, I think
50
50
years.
some years.
Yeah.
But other than that, the vast majority of them have cropped up in the past, I can do math, 7-8 years, right?
Yeah.
And so That's a very good point, right?
Yeah.
And sort of like if you really want to sit and interrogate this, right, you have to sit with that and recognize the timeline of real events as it relates to this. So
Yeah.
good point.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the recommendations that are in the report
Oh yeah.
that Color of Change and Little Sis make. I thought this section was pretty powerful.
Yeah.
They aim them at corporations, policymakers, and community members. So each piece of that puzzle had sort of an action step on what to do from where you sit. So corporations are asked to step down from these boards and divest from donating any money to them. Policymakers are encouraged to hold hearings, mandate disclosure of donations and board membership, and require public approval of expenditures. Right, which apparently a city, I think it was in Missouri, has already approved that any kind of expenditure from the police foundation has to be approved through the city in some way.
Right.
So that things like in Atlanta, those cameras getting just abandoned by the foundation and left up to the city to manage doesn't happen. And then for community members, regular folks, I think we need to try to take their suggestion was that we try to take a look at our local police foundations and scrutinize what they're doing,
Yep.
who's supporting them, and then put pressure on those companies who are supporting them, whether we work at those companies or support them in some way, like buying their products or shopping there, whatever it might be. Putting pressure on them because they're supporting these unaccountable organizations that are just funneling money into police departments.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that part. I think, that's a critical piece of any sort of report like this, right?
Yeah,
And so I think that's some good action steps. And I also really appreciated they highlighted that Coca-Cola, right, was like engaged in conversations with Color of Change, right, based on this report, based on their findings, and like through ongoing conversations. I think Coca-Cola, who was at the time, actually one of the Atlanta Police Foundation's largest corporate donors, actually stepped down from that foundation's board of trustees. And I think that just happened like in April of this year, earlier this year. So like this stuff actually can happen, right? And that's why this work is important, right? So I applaud Color of Change and Little Sis for doing this, right? And the work that they're doing, particularly with our with these corporations and with policymakers, right? Because it can make a difference. And in the case of a huge corporation like Coca-Cola, it did, right? So I appreciate that.
Yeah. All right, let's shift a little bit, talk about application and how this influences our daily lives.
Yeah.
One of the important things here that we didn't get a chance to talk about before now is gentrification. And so there are ties that the report names between gentrification and increased police presence.
Yes.
And then ties between police foundations and real estate and financial companies who are bankrolling the real estate projects that then create gentrification. So these are real direct ties to what's happening with development in our cities and neighborhoods, right? Like these projects, the development projects are almost never designed for the people who are already here, already in the neighborhoods. And then when new people or companies move into the neighborhood, they generally call the police more according to this data.
Yeah.
And then I think, so tying back to last week and the conversation we had about revisions of abolition, Ruth Wilson Gilmore in that film was talking about how we call the police way more for minor inconveniences than we used to.
Yep.
Because they're more present. And so we can tie all these things together and see how these construction projects influence us in our day-to-day lives and encourage us to call the police more. And then we don't necessarily know our neighbors and we can't solve like minor inconveniences amongst each other, right?
Yes.
And then you think about it, police foundations are funded by big tech companies who then want to sell us new surveillance products based on our mistrust of our neighbors.
Oh gosh.
Right. Yeah. So, and they talk about Amazon Ring in the report. And then the police foundations and departments are getting donations from these tech companies. And then they also have access to the video footage that we are providing them by installing the cameras and signing off on what their terms and conditions are. So, it's all like police foundation, I think it sounds like a very abstract concept, but then you think about who's funding them, are the same people who are funding like large scale development projects that are gentrifying neighborhoods and pushing out like long-term residents,
Yeah.
who are also then facing violence, like
At the hands of.
physical violence at the hands of over policing.
Absolutely. That's great. Right. And I think I'm glad you brought that up because it speaks to there's a lot more in this report that we aren't clearly going to get to talk about. Right. But it speaks to the point that all of this is application. Right. All of this is applicable.
indeed.
Like every piece of this is because it is about sort of our communities. Right. And what is really keeping us safe and what is not. And so, yeah, I think application here sort of maybe is homeworky too, right? But like everyone needs to take some time and read this report because I think the idea that these foundations exist, right, is hidden, right, and not known to the public, and the work that they're doing is just not known. So I encourage folks to read this. I think another piece of application, which is certainly difficult to sort of think about because I know it's something I struggle with, and I think a lot of folks will resonate with this when I say it, right? But like, what does it mean to us as individuals and also to us as a society, right? To learn about these police foundations, and I think specifically to think about how so many of these police foundations' top corporate sponsors made public statements, as you said earlier, right, in support of Black Lives Matter in 2020, but they're still engaged with these foundations, right? And they're still funding these police foundations. Like, what does that mean for us? What does that mean in terms of how we engage with these companies and corporations that are named in this report? And I'm sure that there are more. What does that mean in terms of how we choose to spend our money, right? And who we give our business to, right? Those are really tough questions, but I think we have to sort of ask ourselves and really think about that. And I know so much of what we do as people is based on what's convenient, right, and what's quick. And life is hard, and life comes at you fast, and you have to make decisions about things. And sometimes it's about catching that sale, right, and all of that good stuff. But when you look at I named some of them, but there are a whole lot more companies on there. It's like, wow, I shop here.
Yeah.
I just flew in Southwest. They were on the list, right? Like, man, like what does, now that I've read this and I know this, what does that mean moving forward?
Yeah, I think that application is important of like, what does this mean for my daily life? Who is it that I'm shopping with, and what are they doing? Are they still supporting this? And all those are great questions to ask and sit with. All right, let's talk a little bit about homework. Honestly, there's so much here. But I think my homework is to look at the recommendation sections of this report, and then put pressure on the companies and brands that we use or we buy stuff from, to divest from these foundations and step down from these boards. I know that'll be some of the work that I'm doing, along with looking into if there are police foundations for some of the local jurisdictions around us. We live outside of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is named a few times throughout this report. So there's definitely one for D.C., but the surrounding areas here in Maryland, like, are there foundations as well? So, like, do they exist? Who's funding them? What are they doing? What are they up to as well? I think it is also important homework for any of us thinking about this. Like, do our local jurisdictions have police foundations too?
Absolutely. Co-signed. Yeah. I think we all need to be thinking about this and doing our own research into our own communities, right, to see what's happening, right? And so now that it's time to do the work. I think the other thing to sort of do, and it's part of the recommendations that they make too, is this, like, if you find out that it exists, right, or even if it doesn't exist near you in your local community and you're just compelled to do this, right? The website that this is all connected to is policefoundations.org, and they actually have a petition on their site that you can sign to demand change and accountability as sort of one step that you can take to contribute to this effort I should say. So I think that's good homework for sure. I grew up in Baltimore, and the Baltimore County Police Foundation is named in this report. And in like the resource section, there are a bunch of links about the actual Baltimore County Police Foundation. And so also some homework for me is to click on those links, learn a little bit more about that foundation and to see sort of what they're doing. And I certainly don't live there now, but a lot of my family does. And so I think we certainly will. For my family who's listening, I know that there's some of you who do, and we have a weekly call on Saturday nights. Yeah, we're going to be talking about this because we've all got to be engaged in this. So that's my homework for the week.
Yeah. And one of the other links I just thought about, as you mentioned, policefoundations.org. I don't remember the link for this, so maybe we'll post this on social media.
Okay.
But the one of the links in the project, in the report, link was a database that showed you what the percentage of a city budget was, like how much of the city budget went to policing.
Oh.
So you could look up Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and a lot of major cities across the country and see what the percentage was. You could see their total budget and then the total budget for the police, and then it showed you a pie chart of how big that piece of the pie was.
Brilliant.
So it's also an easy way to look at like how much money are we actually spending on this?
Yes.
This function of the city. So,
and do you recall, is it just policing, or do they also other sort of social services and education? And
it was just policing.
That's
Yeah.
great. No, that's still great.
In some cities it's like, well, it's 48% or it's 37%. And so there's a lot of money being spent, as you mentioned earlier in one of your statistics about how it's gone up 46% in the last number of years.
Yeah, let's post that for sure.
All right. So that's it for this week's conversation around police foundations and this report. And Damien, you are up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I am. All right. So for our next episode, I'm bringing an article to the table for us. Mm-hmm. It is called "Police Violence is a Disability Justice Issue" by Derica Purnell. And it was published on the Boston Review's website just last month on September 29th, 2021, if you want to go and try to find it. And actually, this article is an excerpt from, or it could even be a full chapter. I'm not 100% sure. It was either an excerpt or a full chapter from her upcoming book, Becoming Abolitionist, Police, Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom, which I shouldn't have said upcoming because it just came out this month. Yep. And so I know that this is a book we both want to read. But I think, as the sort of title alludes to, right, like this piece will sort of serve as a way for us to continue this conversation about the power of police violence and our ongoing conversations about abolition, right? But this piece has a particular focus on the necessity of abolition given the context of the history and impact of police violence on disabled folks and specifically disabled Black folks, right? And so I think, as we have said, we're all in for abolition, right? And so this is another piece of why this work and why abolition is important, right? And so I cannot wait to read this article and bring it to the table for us to talk about. Yes. Wait a minute. I'm looking over, y'all, and Aaron has his Kindle out, and I think I see the book on the Kindle.
Yep. I started reading it recently, and it is very good so far.
Oh, man.
So it's going to be a great conversation on our next episode because, her writing is very clear and, relatable and makes ideas around abolition very crystallized, I think.
Sweet.
Okay. And I've just gotten through the introduction and part of the first chapter, like literally just started. But,
okay. All right. I'm behind. I gotta buy it and get on this. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. At least initially I gotta read this article, but I want the whole book too. So very good.
Absolutely. So all right. Well, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but maybe you forgot. Please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, and sign up for our email list to get notified about new stuff we have going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Folks, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. We'll talk to you next week.